ASP.NET Core is the next generation of Microsoft's web development technology. If you're used to classic ASP.NET MVC, ASP.NET Core is going to be very familiar to you. But there are some significant changes. One of the big things, which is a nice feature, is that it includes integrated web API and MVC features, one controller to rule them all. In classic ASP.NET, you had to create different controllers that inherited from different objects based on whether or not you were creating a web API service or a controller for an MVC application. But now there's a single unified object that each of these controller types inherit from, and so it makes it much easier to create both web services and MVC applications within a single web application. ASP.NET Core includes a vastly improved configuration system. For now, it's based on JSON files, but Microsoft is looking at modifying that. But overall, the configuration story is far better than what we used to have to deal with web.config and other .config types of files. Another really nice benefit is that ASP.NET Core includes great support for seamless dependency injection. And it's really quite usable now. So this is the sort of situation where if you knew you had to use dependency injection in classic ASP.NET and really struggled with it, well, first of all, there were good reasons you struggled with it, because it really wasn't an inherent, it wasn't integrated into ASP.NET well. Microsoft has changed all that, and boy, it is a really nice system for injecting different kinds of dependencies into your code. And it allows you to write much cleaner code. The system for using dependency injection is very slick, and it just makes the code much more elegant. Another new feature is tag helpers. This is a big improvement over HTML helpers. Like HTML helpers, tag helpers let server-side code participate in creating and rendering HTML elements in Razor files. But tag helpers reduce the explicit transitions between HTML and C# in Razor views. Basically, tag helpers use HTML attributes to do their work rather than explicit method calls. Another new feature are view components. These are kind of similar to classic ASP.NET partial views, but don't use model binding and only depend on the data that you provided. They're a better, more streamlined way to let you reuse rendering logic. Okay, so all in all, this is just a few of the changes, but ASP.NET Core is a pretty big change. And we're going to dive into those features in the second part of this course. But for now, let's look at how you can build an ASP.NET Core application on top of .NET Core using the command line tools. What I'm going to do now is turn this lowly Hello World application into a much cooler web application. So there's various things I need to do. First of all, I'm going to include a few more using statements here. I'm going to be using system.io. And I'll also be using a few namespaces that are associated with ASP.NET Core. I'll include a builder namespace, and a hosting namespace, and an HTTP namespace. Notice that I don't get full IntelliSense quite yet. That's part of what's coming in tooling, but the IntelliSense does learn. So you notice that the first time that I used Microsoft, it didn't know about that namespace. But then the second time I used namespace, or Microsoft as the namespace, it remembered it, and it also remembered ASP.NET Core. Okay, so again, this is Visual Studio Code. It's not the full, complete, rich development environment of Visual Studio, but it's very usable. Okay. Then the other thing I'm going to do is get rid of the contents of my main method here. Just delete all that. because what I need to do is create the environment in which the web application is going to run. So I'm going to var a new host object and new up a web host builder. Okay, so this is the basic object. This is going to return the basic object that I need in order to allow this application to interact with the web server. And the web server that I'm going to use is a new one called Kestrel. All right, so basically that is a cross-platform web server that you can use on any of the platforms and is essentially self-contained within the application. That's all that I'm really going to talk about Kestrel at this point. But when we get deeper into web applications, we'll talk more about what exactly Kestrel is. Now, I need to tell it where my startup parameters or where my startup code is. So I'm going to use startup and specify that it's contained in a startup class. And that class we need to create before we can compile the application. And then finally, I'm going to execute the build method that causes this new web host builder to create the web host and allow the application to run. And then finally, after I've created the host, I'm going to execute the host run method. Oops, if I can type, in order to actually run the application. Okay, so I'll hit Control S to save that so far. Okay, so as I mentioned, also I need to create this startup class. So this needs to be a public class. And within that, I need to find a public configure method that returns nothing, so type void. And it's going to receive an iApplicationBuilder object. Now within that, I'm going to execute the run method of that iApplicationBuilder. And within that, actually I'm going to put this up here, I'm going to call an asynchronous method, passing in the context, and run this method. And in this simple example, I'm just going to write out some text out to the web page. And like the console application, I'll say hello world. It is, and I'll use the datetime object and the now. And display the long time string. And need another parentheses there. Oh, no, I don't already have it. And that's the end of the statement. Okay, hopefully, let me make sure. I'll correct some typos here. And I'm open and closing bracket right there, open and closing there, open and closing. Okay, I think I've got it. This belongs to that, and that belongs to that, and that, and so forth. Okay, I'll hit Control S and save my changes. Okay, so that's the code that I'm going to execute. So I'll talk about app.run a little bit more shortly, But again, all this is really going to do is display some text out to the web page. But this is an ASP.NET Core application, so we're going to have to view it in the browser. It's not going to display in the console like the previous version of the application. Now, in order to use the Kestrel web server, I also need to make a change to the project.json file. So I'll open that up. And here you can see that file. As you can see, there's some version information. So in this case, it's going to use version 1.0.0 and any minor version of that. I have some build options, and we'll actually expand on that a little bit later. I can define dependencies. Notice that there aren't any particular dependencies yet here. But this is what where I'm going to add a statement, because we have to add a dependency to the Kestrel server. And then you can also see the frameworks that you can include here. And in this case, I'm using the .NET Core app version 1.0, and it has various versions. Remember that I'm using version 1.01 of .NET Core. Okay, so the change that I need to make is here within dependencies. And what I need to do is include Microsoft. Notice that it does have IntelliSense for some of the different dependencies that are available, so it has some intelligence. And I can put in ASP.NET Core, and notice that it has some information about ASP.NET Core, and I need server and .kestrel. Now the nice thing about this is that I also get IntelliSense on the different versions. Now in this particular case, notice that I have available, there are packages available for the alpha version 0.0.1 alpha, 1.0.0, which is the initial release version, RC2, the final, 1.01, and 1.1 preview. So at this point, Microsoft is working on the next version, and it has a preview package available. But in this case, I'm going to stick with release versions and use 1.0.1 because that's the version of the .NET Core that I'm using here locally. Okay, now, so those are all the changes that I need to make to the application. So I'm going to come back over to my command line here. Because I changed project.json, I need to do a .NET restore in order to rebuild that lock file, as well as download any packages, as well as their dependencies. And as you can see, by including the Kestrel package, there's a number of other dependencies that are required in order to run that package. And through the magic of NuGet, it automatically downloads, or .NET Core automatically downloads all of the dependencies that I don't already have within this project. All right, so that's pretty slick. And as you saw, it happened pretty quick. Where I am, I have a fairly quick cable internet, and so it downloaded fairly quickly. But the nice thing here is that now that they're downloaded, they're here on the local machine, and I can pack up my laptop if I'm working on my laptop and go work offline entirely. Okay, so that's part of the nice thing that .NET Core is built using NuGet. Okay, so the next thing I'm going to do is run .NET run. And here's where I find out if I made any code errors. Nervously waiting. Oop, date time does not contain definition for new. Okay, obviously I have a spelling error there. And that should be now. And I'll save that again, go back to my command line, and attempt to run it again. Okay, that's pretty good. All right, so you can see that it compiled successfully, and it's now a hosting environment, and it has the root path to where the files were put, the output for the code was. And it's now listening on, the Kestrel is now listening on HTTP localhost 5000. Okay, so I can fire up, in this case I'll use Chrome, but I can use any browser that I want. And I can go to localhost 5000, hit enter, and it'll fire everything up. And there we have the text that we output from this web application. So voila, we've now converted that console application that just outputs some simple text to the console window, have converted it into a web application. Now, admittedly, this is a super trivial example, but it highlights the basic process of how an ASP.NET Core application bootstraps on top of the .NET Core runtime. You can see the same console application structure is used for ASP.NET. This is still a console application, and my entry point is still main. There's no magic. You have full control all the way from the initial bootstrapping of the application through the startup configuration and into the full ASP.NET pipeline. All right, let's start drilling down into the code that made this simple but very real ASP.NET Core application. As I mentioned, ASP.NET Core applications are self-contained console applications that self-host the Kestrel web server. The code in main basically hoists up a new instance of Kestrel and configures it to handle web requests. The configuration is delegated to the startup class, which usually lives in a separate file. But for simplicity, I'm putting everything in a single file here within program.cs. Now, the startup class is where you can hook up custom middleware that's added to the ASP.NET pipeline. Middleware is essentially what we thought of as HTTP handlers and HTTP modules in classic ASP.NET. It's the stuff that makes things happen in an ASP.NET Core web application. And here in this startup class is where you have a ton of options and flexibility for how you hoist up your web application. Now, in the code so far, I use this app.run method. This is a middleware handler, which is roughly the equivalent of an HTTP handler in classic ASP.NET. When app.run gets fired, it's expected to handle the inbound request completely and return a result. And that's what we did here. We wrote out something out to the web page. You can think of app.run as a last resort handler that's fired when nothing else has handled the request. In the code here, there is nothing else that's handling requests, so the app.run handler is fired, and hence we see that hello world message. But another option that you can use here is app.use, the use method. If app.run is like an HTTP handler, app.use is like an HTTP module. App.use handlers can be chained together and are fired in the order that they appear. Unlike HTTP modules in classic ASP.NET, though, ASP.NET Core middleware can handle both before and after request processing. So what I'm going to do now is modify the hello world sample with an app.use handler that hooks in pre- and post-processing for each request on the server. All I'm going to do in this particular case is just output a little bit of text before hello world and then a little bit of text after hello world, but it'll show you how code is called and the order in which different things execute. Okay, so the way that I'm going to modify the configure method is I'm going to leave the app.run in place. But now I'm going to execute an app.use method, and its signature is fairly similar to app.run. But I'm providing this next object, and I'll talk more about that in just a moment. Okay. And what I want to have happen is I'm going to execute this asynchronously. I'm going to use the context object again to access the response object. Again, the response object is just a regular HTTP response object, something that if you've worked with classic ASP.NET, you're probably familiar with. It gives you access to the output stream that will be rendered within the browser. And I'm going to write something asynchronously. Notice that Visual Studio Code now knows about the write async method. And I'm going to output a note that says it's pre-processing. And then I'm going to execute the next method, which tells .NET Core to go and execute the next handler, the next middleware in sequence. That goes off and executes, which means that app.run is going to execute. When that is completed, execution will come back here, and I can execute more code after this code executes. And in this case, I'll just copy and paste this because it's going to be a very similar kind of code. And I'll change that to a semicolon. And I'm going to change this to post-processing and put a semicolon before it. And also change that to a semicolon. Okay. All right, so again what's happening is when the startup method is called, I'm telling the application to execute the code, the configure method within my startup class. It'll execute ASP.use because that is the first bit of middleware within the configure method. It'll execute that line of code, jump to the next handler, and if the next handler is something that can jump to a following handler and so forth, then I can string a bunch of these methods together, which makes for some very powerful request processing and response for web requests. App.run is middleware of last resort, so there's no way to jump from here to other middleware, so this is kind of the termination point. This code will execute, and it'll jump back and execute that statement right there. All right, so I'll save the file, and I'll come back over to my command line. Now, I need to stop the web server in order to, and shut it down because I changed the code. And now what I can do is do .NET Run again. Now, it's important to understand that I don't need to run .NET Restore again because I haven't changed project.json. I haven't defined additional dependencies that this code relies upon. All right, so we'll go ahead and compile it. Hopefully I didn't make any errors. Oh, I sure did. Okay, so line 26. I did something with context next. Opening paragraph, that. Oops. I forgot open and closing parentheses or brackets here. Okay, an example of where the actual error wasn't quite what the problem was. So let me look. Okay, we have open and closing there. Closing bracket there and there. Okay, that looks good. Let me try again. Oh, still a problem. 2642, comma expected. It would help spell this correctly. Okay, I think that's probably, rather than seeing it as an async keyword, it was thinking it was a method. Did I save that? Save it, come back here. It looks like we may still have something a little further on as well. There we went. Okay, so it's still running at localhost 5000. If I come back over here and refresh that, notice that our app.use method executed the first part of it, then it went on to display the hello world, and then came back and executed the app.use code again. Okay, so what happened here is that app.use, that middleware, wrapped itself around the app.run call. Go back over the code here, and that's essentially what happened here. The middleware pipeline strings together all pieces of middleware one after the other, and each piece of middleware calls the next in the chain. The middleware handlers are executed in order going in, and then in reverse order going out. It's sort of like stack behavior. Again, if you think of the analogy with older ASP.NET versions, you can think of it as pre and post request handler processing. All the pre-handlers fire until the pipeline has no more middleware, or an operation doesn't call next. And then it reverses and walks the chain the other way. It's a simple and elegant concept that's used by other server implementations, such as Node.js.